you so much to the East Kingdom College of Performers for giving me the opportunity today to speak to you all. I am really excited to be able to share a little bit of a topic that I was able to do some research on, and I'm going to go ahead and start presenting. So give me 1 second. All right, well, the world of Baroque music, and opera specifically, is filled with the names of composers that we all know of. Jacopo Peri, George Friedrich Handel, Claudio Monteverdi, among many others. But there is one particular composer that is often overlooked, but whose wealth of works and contributions to musical and theatrical advancements at the beginning of the Baroque era are absolutely undeniable. So today I wanted to take some time to highlight an amazing composer that unfortunately I was not privy to learning about when I was in school, and coming across her work and her contributions was really sort of enlightening for me, and I wanted to be able to share that with you today. And that is Francesca Caccini from Florence. So Francesca was born in 1587 to the well-known Italian composer Giulio Caccini. She quickly gained renown, ultimately rising to become the highest paid musician in the mid-1620s in the Medici court. She frequently performed with her family in an ensemble called Le Donne di Giulio with her stepmother and her sister. The musical tutelage that she gained under her father, who was a very well-known composer within the Medici court as well, and also taught, gained her a lot of experience as a teacher, a lutenist, a Spanish guitarist, a harpist, a virtuoso singer, excuse me. She unfortunately is often forgotten as a contributor to early opera and early 17th century Italian music. One of the primary reasons is because the vast majority of her works have not survived, but her legacy is definitely remembered. After being hired by the Medici court, she continued to perform until her sister was married and then moved to Mantua. What I love about the turn of the century, the turn of the 17th century, is the race for primacy amongst the composers of the time in the world of opera. There was a lot of new and exciting material and exciting musical progress that was being made. And so the rush to create this new art form really sort of took shape within Italy at this time, specifically around with the Medici court. And watching how the composers vied for each other and they worked together and then subverted each other was really an interesting thing to really be able to research. And if you have the opportunity to read about that time period with Jacopo Peri and Giulio Caccini, I strongly suggest that you look it up because it's definitely one of those things that could easily be dramatized in some fashion. So right around that time period, Giulio Caccini was working on creating his own versions of opera, as well as Jacopo Peri, who we know created the first surviving opera, Eurydice, or Eurydice, as it would be in Italian. And what I love about this is that Francesca Caccini was actually asked to sing in the original performance of Peri's production. And unfortunately, though, Peri was not able to write the music for her because many of the students that Giulio Caccini had in his court at that time, he demanded that he write the music in Peri's opera in order for them to perform. And at 13 years old, La Cecchina, or the Songbird, as was her nickname in the Medici court, she was able to perform for the nuptials of Marie de Medici and Henry IV of France. That particular performance and then her subsequent performances helped to catapult her into renown in the musical world and within the Medici court. In fact, after that particular performance, she was asked, her and her entire family were asked to travel to be in the court of Henry IV, in which they did go for quite a while, and they stayed. But when asked to be a member of the court and write for Henry IV, unfortunately, Ferdinando I of Tuscany refused and had them come back to be members of the Medici court once again. Now, as they came back, and Francesca assumed her role as a composer and a teacher to many of the women in court, she ended up creating this vast amount of music that we unfortunately don't have a lot of anymore. However, there is one extant musical book that she did write that we do have intact, which is a really interesting piece, and it provides us a lot of her non-theatrical and pedagogical music that we still have today. What's really interesting about this particular collection is that it has 32 monodies in it, and there are a variety of styles between sacred music, secular music, there are solos, there are duets between sopranos and basses, and they really expand the breadth of what was possible for the voice at that time. There were very simple pieces, there were very florid pieces, and one of the quirks about her and her father's particular composition style is that they wrote out each and all of the melismatic phrases and all of the embellishments that were to be performed, which wasn't necessarily always the norm. In a lot of Baroque music, and even much past that, performers had a lot of leeway when it came to being able to embellish and perform on their own any of these particular melismatic phrases and embellishments. But we do know that her and her father wrote out all of those particular embellishments and melismatic phrases so that they could be performed as the composer had intended. And as we heard earlier in the class regarding the castrati, that sometimes some performers, especially those who are very confident in their abilities, will take a lot of leeway with those particular embellishments, and sometimes it can rub the composer the wrong way sometimes. So she was very adamant about making sure that the embellishments that she wrote were the ones that were going to be performed. Now, what is really exciting about this particular book that we have is that this was the first collection of music that was written by a woman, specifically for a woman, and was approved by the powerful women of the Medici court. So we really have, at the time, a piece, like a collection of pieces that was used that really sort of celebrated women and their abilities to break into a world that was often rejected to them. And so what I find really exciting about that is that we have this piece, and that she has a lot of notes at the beginning and at the end of it that sort of talk a little bit about her pedagogical approach, which is often referenced a lot from her father's book as well, who created his own musical book, La Nuova Musique. And but yeah, so we have this time capsule of music that we really get to reference that was specifically for women and was created for women by women and was approved by the Medici court, which was a really big undertaking at the time. But one of the pieces that is the most impressive from my perspective was what we can consider the first opera written by a woman, La Liberazione di Ruggiero dall'isola d'Alcina. Now, this particular opera is the only extant opera that we have from Francesca Caccini. Now, we know it's not the only opera that she wrote, but this is the only one that we do happen to have still intact today. Now, this particular piece was inspired by the composers of her time, Jacopo Peri, Cavalieri, her father, Monteverdi. And so Caccini began work on this massive full-scale production. And as we know, that the development of opera turned into these giant spectacles. And as we'll see how that really related in just a bit. But the libretto was written by Ferdinando Saracinelli. And Caccini adapted the subplots from cantos 6 through 8 of Orlando Furioso. And she created this production that wasn't called an opera at the time. She billed it as a balletto because there was a fair amount of dance that was included in this particular production. However, historians have considered this to be, it had all the trappings of a contemporary opera at the time. So we are attributing the first opera written by a woman to her. And this particular piece was commissioned for the arrival of Prince Vladislav of Poland in 1625. And what was so impressive about this performance was that this production was also requested to be remounted in Poland. And although this is disputed today, there are some sources that don't necessarily agree with this. It has long been considered to be the first Italian opera to be performed outside of Italy. Yet again, proving that she deserves to have the recognition that she really is entitled to for her contributions to the early world of opera. The actual plot for this particular of opera is really interesting as well, because though generally speaking, Baroque operas really referred to myths of the time, like Greek myths, and we're really writing about these giant Greek and Roman mythological characters and their exploits. This particular opera that she wrote talks about an epic poem that isn't necessarily someone that was so mythologically impressive. But so this particular opera was, again, focused on a small subplot. And after being captured by the sorceress Alcina and placed underneath her spell, believing her to be a young and beautiful woman, Ruggiero is aided by another sorceress named Melissa to escape the island of Alcina. And seeing his future and being betrothed to his true love, Bradamante, Melissa, the other sorceress, attempts to rescue Ruggiero out from Alcina's spell. Now, Melissa, the more powerful of the two sorceresses, forces Alcina to flee the island. And when that happens, the other enchanted people on the island that have been turned into trees and rocks spring to life, begging Melissa to rescue them as well. Well, Alcina returns with other sorceresses on horseback and on whaleboats, and then ultimately rides a dragon upon which Alcina ultimately escapes. All of the enchanted people are rescued, and then celebrations ensue, culminating in a giant ballet with 8 horses, all on horseback. It really is, from the accounts at the time, really was an impressive spectacle to be seen for anyone that was in attendance. Now, what I also find really interesting is that musically, this is a really interesting, very Baroque idea. And Baroque operas at this time really sort of were musically different from what we think of as traditional concert music from the Baroque era. So it was accompanied by long chords on a keyboard instrument. Oftentimes it would be a harpsichord. We would have these repeating ritornellos framing all the arias, often interspersed in between verses. And I have an example of that coming up in just a bit. There were also recitative patterns after Monteverdi's Stile Moderno, which is sort of different from the traditional trappings of recit from slightly earlier, even though there wasn't a lot to pull from. The Stile Moderno is really playing a little bit more on single melodic lines with interesting and different ways of handling dissonance, and that you can hear throughout some of the recit pieces in the actual opera. But what I found really impressive about this particular opera too was the way that she used keys to denote characters. She would use flat keys, or keys with 1 or 2 flats, in order to denote any of our women characters. All of the sharp keys were for her men's characters, but she uses the key of C for the androgynous sorceress, Alcina. So it's really, so she really sort of frames the musical patterns as well to represent her characters. And so when we sort of see the progression of operas, especially as we get to later operas with leitmotifs and we think of Wagner, we can sort of see how there are certain trappings that that we can reference to and we can see way earlier in the history of opera. Also, what I find interesting too is that as the musical complexity and the fluidity of all of the passages increases as the opera progresses as well. Additionally, we look at and see that the tempo of the pieces also increases as we make our way to the ending, ultimately ending in this giant eight person motet that finishes the opera during the horseback scene at the very end, the horseback ballet. I want to play now for you the aria of the shepherd, just to give you an idea. This occurs fairly early in the opera, and it's also a shepherd character, so there's not a lot of florid activity. There's not a lot of melismatic phrases happening as well. So I wanted to, it's really difficult to find many recordings of this particular piece as it is. In fact, there's not a lot of recordings available, but I did want to give you a chance to hear some of the Monteverdi-inspired stile moderno and the ritornellos that are happening with the trio of recorders that frame the two verses of the aria that you're going to hear. So I'm going to pull this up in a different tab. All right, give me 1 second. This particular, the ritornello with the three, it would have been performed with recorders in the time, but that particular ritornello was a direct nod to one of the ones in Peri's Eurydice. So I found that to be really interesting, which was her first opera performance back when she was 13. So I thought that was a really interesting tidbit to share. So let me pull up maybe. There we go. So Francesca Caccini has a lasting legacy with the incredible output that was unfortunately mostly lost. We know that Caccini broke many barriers within courtly life in the realm of music. As an avid teacher, performer, and composer, she rose to prominence as being the highest paid musician in the mid-1620s in the Medici court. Solidifying herself as a prominent musician, she championed the roles of women. She championed the roles women could play on stage and off. With their focus on composing and teaching music for women, it has a lasting impression even today. Finally, the archetype of the seductress turned evil sorceress provided a prototype that would shape many characters in the history of opera. Again, I think that she is definitely one of the most interesting early Baroque opera composers that we have, and again was one that I had not necessarily heard a lot about, but I think that her contributions are just as important as many of the ones that we continue to celebrate today. Thank you so much again for giving me this opportunity. Does anyone have any questions?